We have these different disciplines and different modes of looking at reality and different questions that they can answer. The questions that science can't answer, other disciplines can answer those questions, and what science demonstrates or can find can help shed light on the questions the philosophers or theologians are asking.
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Maggia Center podcast. I'm Catherine Hadra with my co-host for the last time, Dr. Daniel Keebler.
Yeah, here we are on our last episode of this project. So it's been a pleasure doing this. And so
it's been a joy and it's flown by. You know, obviously we're ending season 5, which really brings to completion our vision for Purposeful Lab. And this all started because of the Purposeful Universe project, which kicked off 3 years ago.
Yeah, so this was, this whole project was made possible by a John Templeton Foundation grant that we got, and it was also supported by a grant from the USCCB, the United States Catholic Bishops Conference. And we started looking at this project. We made some videos with some scientists looking and focusing on the order you see in biology and chemistry and physics, and how that sort of points towards or is consistent with the idea that there's purpose and order and there's a meaning to the universe and so forth, rather to try to combat the popular notion that that science shows that there's no meaning or purpose in life. And then this project sort of evolved from those videos to, I thought, well, it would be great to bring people on and have a podcast where we can actually get more detailed
extended
discussion.
Conversation.
Exactly. And then, not just philosophers, but theologians and psychologists and
artists.
Scientists. And so getting looking at, the sort of the unity of truth, like how do you approach truth from all these different disciplines, and does it lead you in the same direction, and that's something that we try to stress on the podcast with all different guests that we've had.
And I know I've learned a lot. I have so much gratitude for the Templeton Project that this is even possible, that we're able to have these kind of conversations to reach more people and explore these different ideas. And again, there's been so much purpose to, pun intended, to this project and to the vision of the podcast. Season 1, we really had this bird's eye view, I would say, of the entire mission of Purposeful Universe and looking at that abundant order of the universe and how it spans. Season 2, we focused on cosmology. Season 3, biological evolution, your area of expertise, Dan, for consciousness. And then this 5th and final season on human flourishing. And there's really an intentionality to that order as well.
Yeah, we sort of, after we gave the overview, it's sort of building up some sort of the foundational sort of physics of the universe to what is that, the order of that physics. Out of that comes chemistry, and out of that comes biology. And then from the order of biology and evolution, out comes this creature, this sort of outlier, humans, right? And what does that mean? Are we at home in the universe? Are we foreign to the universe? And we really want to stress that, no, the humans are sort of a microcosm of the universe. We're where the material world that we talk about in the first 2 seasons comes to fruition and is in contact with sort of the spiritual world and how humans sort of transcend, the physical world, but yet we're grounded in the physical world, and the physical world sort of points to, that order there allows humans to come to be.
It's been just under a year that we've been able to collaborate in this way, specifically on Purposeful Lab. When you're reflecting back on these past 5 seasons, are there specific moments that stood out to you, a big lesson that you took away with?
Yeah, from a, as a biologist, I have my own sort of field and expertise that I like to get into. But I think what really stood out to me was how much I learned from the guests in the other disciplines and sort of the synergies I saw, with some of the other disciplines. I remember talking about art, right? You would think, well, art and biology are totally different. Right. How do they go together? And sort of the notion that art is grounded, like good art is grounded in the physical world, like a sculpture. It's specific to our material being. It's not some esoteric thing, right? It reflects the material world around us. And I think that in science, you're looking at grounded in that material world, but then as you reflect upon science, it goes beyond that, so there's this synergy, I think, between the artist and the scientist, and that discovery and the creativity that comes from art and science. So I was struck a lot. I think that's true in other disciplines as well. I was just struck by sort of the deep synergy from our guests, and also the humility of a lot of our guests. That we have really brilliant people on here, but the humility of their openness to what they don't know, right? And I think that's something that as a society we kind of lack.
That's what stood out to me as I look back on some themes that just, without us even planning it, just themes that came to the surface and speaking with these different interviews and different areas. And that theme of humility did keep rising to the surface, and the importance of humility in science. And also, and you say this a number of times, Dan, that science can't answer every single question there is. And for scientists to have that kind of humility, to recognize that as well.
Yeah, and that's why we have these different disciplines, and different disciplines have different modes of looking at reality and different questions that they can answer, and how the questions that science can't answer, other disciplines can answer those questions, and what science demonstrates or can find can help shed light on the questions the philosophers or theologians are asking.
Yeah.
And being in dialogue can really spur sort of creativity and different ways of thinking about your own discipline, looking at your own discipline differently because what you know from philosophy or theology or psychology. So I think that to me is that's the purpose of a liberal arts education, right, at the university, which being able to get a broad perspective on the truth, and that's what we tried to provide through the podcast.
Wide-ranging interviews, and again, our whole mission here was to ask these big questions and seeking the truth. And sometimes that required bringing on those different areas of expertise to do so, which again were far-ranging. And we thought the best way to honor this podcast as it comes to its conclusion as we're wrapping up is to look back at some of those highlights, really some of those fan favorite moments that I think do a good job of capturing what we've done. So let's just look at one clip right now. This is from Dr. Sophia Carosa. She was on a few different episodes throughout different seasons. She's a Catholic neuroscientist and a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard Medical School. Here's a clip on Dr. Sophia Carosa talking about how nothing in neuroscience makes sense without evolution.
There's a saying of Theodosius Dobzhansky that I'm a big fan of, that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And he was actually in that essay arguing for theistic evolution, it's sometimes called. So he's not saying that evolution explains everything, but rather that it's an essential ingredient to include in the picture if we're going to make sense of the facts in front of our eyes. And I really think nothing in neuroscience makes sense except in light of evolution. There are just so many structures within our brain that we've inherited from our evolutionary ancestors and that don't make sense unless you consider our origin over time through evolution. So things like vestigial organs that were involved in chemosensation back in, bacterial times, and or elements of our brain structure that have homologs in other species that play similar roles and have similar structures. And so one of the things that Dobzhansky says in this article is that either God intentionally placed all of these signs in our reality to trick us, or we came to be through evolution. And it makes sense of how the brain is organized and shaped and how it functions and our similarity to so many other creatures on this earth.
That was definitely a standout moment. And again, Dan, as someone you really focus yourself a lot on evolution, curious on your reaction to
I think the fact that she points out, that evolution, it doesn't conflict with some belief in God, and that she points out, you have all of these similarities in the nervous system if you look at different animals. And so we have to understand the human brain, you have to understand how it came to be, right? And how it works and how you see these different systems in lower animals and so forth. From a faith perspective, we should point, so God would not deceive us and sort of set it up, with all this evidence that this brain has evolved when it actually didn't, right? And so I think there's this, that it doesn't take away from our belief in God, that there's an order there that can allow, God has produced a universe that can evolve, can bring out these amazing brain structures.
Yeah, no, that was fascinating. Another kind of fan favorite was back in season 1 with Dr. Stephen Barr, who you know personally, you've known him for years, you work with him as well. He's a physicist, got his doctorate in theoretical particle physics from Princeton, currently leads the Society of Catholic Scientists. Here's a look back at season 1 when Dr. Stephen Barr spoke how physics cannot capture consciousness, even that of a dog.
Science is sort of coming up against its limits in the sense of what it can and what it can't do. And part of that is to, at least from what we've talked about, is to describe the fullness of like the human person, right? But it can't even seem to, based on what you're saying, describe the fullness of a dog in a sense, because a dog has an aspect to him or her that is not reducible to physics, because dogs, I assume my dog is conscious. I don't know.
We have to assume. See, that's the thing. We don't know.
Yeah.
All we can observe about a dog is its physical behavior. What you can measure about a dog or observe, you can't infer anything rigorously about whether it has a conscious experience. We kind of figure it does. I think my dog, when it wants a piece of bacon, it's because it tastes good. Not just because certain neurons are firing and the machinery is doing this, but it's experiencing something. It's having sensations and mental experiences. But even a dog, and this is quite mysterious. This has nothing to do with religion, by the way.
Right.
A dog, Christianity says nothing about the mental experiences of a dog and whether they are or are not reducible to physics. But they don't seem to be reducible to physics, and I think that's significant.
Yeah, no. Thomas Nagel has that famous paper about what's it like to be a bat, that we can't actually understand the conscious experience of a bat because we're stuck in human conscious experience. Now I can, maybe get an idea of what you're thinking
because we can talk.
We can
because we can converse and express ideas that now, of course, with ChatGPT, of course, if you, I think you can tell if you talk to ChatGPT enough, you realize
if you ask it enough questions,
it doesn't actually have ideas. But that's different. But there's no way to know. Now, there's another philosopher, Thomas Nagel is one, who would argue that mind is not reducible to physics, and he's an atheist. But another great philosopher of our time, Saul Kripke, made the point, and I think it's a decisive point. He said, you could imagine a universe that had exactly the same laws of physics that ours had, but was devoid of consciousness.
Right.
There were no there's no such thing as consciousness, and had all the same laws of physics, the general relativity and quantum mechanics, all the laws that the universe has. And there's nothing illogical about supposing there's in the idea of such a universe. There's no inconsistency in saying there's such a universe. And so that sort of illustrates that these mental phenomena don't come out, they're not derivable from, they're not necessary logical consequences of having physics. There's something beyond physics.
Yeah.
So again, we're hearing this theme that we mentioned earlier, that science has limits to what it can do.
Yeah, and I think everybody's interested when you talk about dogs and dog consciousness.
Your ears perk up, yeah.
Exactly, and the debate is my dog conscious, and how do we know? But that is the point that he points out, that the consciousness doesn't flow out of the physics by necessity. There's something about our conscious experience that goes beyond the physics, and so that should give scientists a pause for humility, that maybe the theories that we have aren't going to be able to explain everything, right? Consciousness is real, right? We all experience and have this conscious sensation. It's a real part of our reality. And how do you explain that? And physics doesn't capture. You can't reduce it to some physical explanation, because the experience is gone when you try to do that.
And we delved a lot more into that topic in particular on consciousness in season 4. So really encourage listeners to go back and look at some of those episodes if they're interested in this topic in particular when it comes to consciousness. Dr. Sophia Carosa, as I mentioned, was on a few different episodes.
That's right. Yeah.
And a lot of what she said was so engaging. I think there is this growing interest in the field of neuroscience and learning how the brain works and what have you. So here's another clip we have of Dr. Sophia Carosa, a popular voice for us, on the question of, did food make our ancestors' brain grow?
The brain this is a little known fact, the most metabolically expensive element of your body. It takes about 20% of your energetic expenditure, at the least, to maintain your cognitive. And it can only run on glucose, unlike most of the rest of the body. Yes, it needs carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And cooking releases it makes energy contained within food more biologically available. So it breaks down things that the human digestive system, even with the help of our microbiome, we wouldn't be able to extract the calories we need from that food without cooking it. And so as humans began using fire for not just protection and light and warmth, but also cooking their food, this likely permitted the expansion of the brain because it could demand greater metabolic resources without killing the human. So this is a big element of the expansion of the brain.
There are a few different theories about why the human brain evolved as it did. This is one of those theories.
Yeah, it's one of the the interesting things about how cost intensive the brain is, how much energy you need for the brain to function, and you got to provide that energy. In cooking, as she points out, the food releases more energy, easily accessible, digestible energy for the brain, and that might drive it. And it's interesting because obviously people say, well, if having a big brain is so good evolutionary, why don't all species have big brains? Well, it's costly, so it's only certain conditions are going to allow that, and so other organisms can't boil their food, so they're not going to be able to get that rich, be able to extract the nutrients as the way humans were able to do. So there were sort of unique sort of circumstances that made it favorable for the brain to grow and to be able to survive. So if other organisms have a larger brain, they'll die because they can't feed that. So it's a lot of different theories on why, but that's a very interesting one.
One of the biggest takeaways I had from multiple conversations we had when it came to the human brain was how it really reflects how we are relational beings. And we see that even how our brain is wired.
I think that fits in with it's sort of at the center of our podcast, in the middle, when we got to the human brain, and before we're talking about biology and chemistry and physics, and then we talk about the relationality of the brain, and then from there we go on to talk about human flourishing and how humans are meant to flourish in society. Right? So you see there in the human brain and the human person this relationality that's essential for us to be who we are meant to be, but that's sort of hardwired into our brain, that it won't develop properly unless it's in a proper relationship with other individuals, which reflects something about God and the relationality we have with God, the relationality God has in the Trinity, and all kinds of interesting things.
No, that came up as well when we were talking about developmental psychology and the importance of relationship for, babies and young children and just what that looks like. And then also a concept that came up a number of times in our podcast was brain plasticity and its ability to change, repair itself, which I think also reflects our ability as humans to heal, to always be pointed towards healing too.
That healing and that freedom that we have, it's not, it's limited in some extent. There's things that we can't do, but that plasticity points to the freedom of us. When we make choices that can change our brain, which can reinforce those choices and the habits and so forth.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of, moments that I remember from these themes. All right. Going back to another throwback with season 1, this was a guest that really stood out to me, Dr. Karin Oberg. She was fascinating. One of our first guests we sat down and spoke with. Brilliant. She is an astrochemist. She's a practicing Catholic. She's a professor of astronomy at Harvard University. Really impressive life and background. And this is her speaking with us back on season 1 about, are other solar systems like ours, or are they different?
In our solar system, we have these rocky planets closer to the sun and the gaseous ones further away and larger. Is that a pattern that you see over and over again? Or is that unique? Yeah.
It's a pattern we think we should see because we think the reason you have this very clear divide is that close to the sun, this dust was just like rock, like silicate. Yeah. And that's actually not that easy to stick together. Once you get a little bit further away from the sun, it gets cold enough that this dust has water ice on it. And you can start building up bigger sort of planet cores more quickly that can then accrete gas and form these giant planets. So we should see it at other places. We are maybe seeing that when we are starting to really be able to gather the data to detect Jupiter and Saturn-like planets at the distances that they are at, but we don't have that much data yet. But the big surprise is that many planets from other stars, so-called exoplanets, that are close in, actually don't look exactly like the Earth. Many of them look like tiny versions of Neptune instead.
Okay, interesting.
We're trying to figure out why that is. There are some good theories. So we don't always see sort of replicas of the solar system. But sometimes we do also see the Earth-like planets that are sitting close to their star. So it's not like we're unique. Like, I guess we're somewhere in between, being the sort of most common outcome and being completely special.
Really fascinating, and she was so easy to speak with, even though she's so brilliant as well.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed speaking with her.
Yeah, and it's interesting in this clip talking about, she's interested in finding life on other planets. So is there other Earth-like planets out there, and how they're, she points out that, well, other solar systems are going to be different than ours. There's a lot of variability out there, but there are other planets that have sort of our properties and are close in the habitable zone and so forth. And so it's this humility. She's, we don't know the answer to that. This is what we see. This is the patterns, and we're still looking. But
seeking that truth.
Seeking that truth. Yeah.
And because of that, she's open to the possibility of there being life on other planets as well.
I think we had different guests on. Some that that there probably isn't life on other planets. We had a couple, and she is one of those that thinks life is. Well, at least microbial life, we'll probably find that on other planets eventually, and that's what her sort of research is her life work is looking for.
Why is it important with this project that we started off on that topic of cosmology and started, looking big as we did?
Yeah, because that's the beginning. So look back, at the beginning, you just, as the universe comes into being, it's like you start, there's no life, there's just... how do you form planets? How do you form solar systems that are necessary for life as we know it to come about? So where's the order and that drives, and this is something that she talked about, the order that drives the formation of the suns and stars and then planets and so forth. And then, how the supernovas of suns create the heavier elements which drive formations of new planets, right? These second generation stars and so forth. And you can see that order leading towards or pointing towards more complex chemistry and then maybe life, right?
Yeah.
And so starting that foundation there, how do we get some order out of chaos?
Absolutely. Well, another fan favorite is also back from season 1, and I think this guest I thought was someone you look forward to speaking with as well, Dr. Simon Conway Morris, who is an English paleontologist, astrobiologist, and evolutionary biologist. He's the Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology at the University of Cambridge. So he spoke to us all the way from the UK across the pond. And here is Dr. Simon Conway Morris on why do the same functions evolve in different species?
If you're interested in the minutiae of evolution, then everything is actually unique. That's certainly the case. But if you're looking at the grand scheme of things, you find that again and again and again, unsurprisingly, in part because of physical constraints, the same solution has reemerged.
You mentioned there the convergent nature of the evolutionary process, right? So you see powered flight evolve multiple times. Now, does that suggest to you, so you could argue, well, it's just, over a course of 4 billion years, just by chance, you're going to get certain things that crop up multiple times. And there's nothing really to see here in terms of convergence. It's just sort of chance, events that have occurred. And anytime you run a complex process for a real long period of time, you might see certain things repeat. But it seems like you're arguing more that there's sort of an underlying pattern that you might see in evolution, where you say, this is predictable. Is that sort of where you would fall?
Indeed, it is. And it is, I think, particularly interesting, if I might give the classic example of convergence. I think it's a legitimate one, and that's the similarity between our eye as a vertebrate and those of the octopus and the squid, which are distantly related to us. And anybody who's done first year zoology will know that to the first approximation, these eyes are almost identical. But then when you look in the details, it turns out there are all sorts of subtle differences. But what is fascinating is that in each and every case, what appears to be an apparent disadvantage or advantage, for example, in the octopus, the retina is on the outmost part of the cells, whereas our retina, of course, is buried underneath another layer of the cells because we derive it from the brain. But in that particular case, what appears to be actually a drawback and a disadvantage and rather sloppy design actually is solved in a truly brilliant way. And therefore, in the longer term, it really doesn't matter whether you've got the eye of an octopus or whether you've got the eye of a human. From the perspective of the eye, I'm not saying much about the brain yet, they will work in, for all intents and purposes, an identical fashion.
Yeah, and the reason that they would work in an identical fashion would be because they both have to do the same thing. That's why you're not going to have flying elephants, right? There's physical constraints that you're not going to be able to generate enough lift to get something that large.
You talk about flying elephants. Well, I'll give you flying elephants if you want to, but unfortunately I've got to do a deal with you. We've got to have a planet which has got a much more thick atmosphere. And if you go to Venus, for instance, the atmosphere on the surface is about equivalent in terms of pressure to a kilometer of seawater. You can certainly envisage Earth-like planets which have rather different atmospheres. And if indeed they were more viscous, effectively, if they were thicker, then something substantially larger in principle could fly. So, but again, we can play with the physics, and those, again, will provide a series of parameters which will allow us to, once again, constrain in an apparently alien environment what something actually turns out to be on the same principles we find here on Earth.
So that was a really interesting point he made about the similarity between the human eye and the eye of an octopus. But there are also differences. Any thoughts you had?
Yeah, this whole idea of convergence that he was talking about, that's one of the things sort of evolutionarily that really I've been fascinated with and sort of changed my way of thinking about evolution, that there's this underlying, as he mentioned, the underlying sort of structure that drives evolution in certain directions. So evolution is not a free-for-all. It reveals sort of this underlying order, and that order shapes it. We were talking about the order in the physics and chemistry leads to certain good solutions, right? And because that's the way the chemistry is, those solutions are going to be found multiple times, which shows that evolution is not just chance and purposeless by nature, but it's dependent upon this underlying order to work at all. And that, I think, it changes often the way you look at the evolutionary process, and that order is primary and drives different things. So if light was different, but the fact that light is the way light is, that influences how evolution is going to
and why
proceed.
Our eyes are located where they are,
right, and how they function,
yeah.
right, and that's sort of a given, and that drives evolution in certain directions. You had that interesting idea of, if you had a much thicker atmosphere, you could have flying elephants, right? So how the physics dictates what you can and can't have, So the atmosphere on Earth means that there's never going to be flying elephants other than in children's books. So.
Only exactly. Well, this last clip from the podcast that we're going to look back on was from season 2, and it's actually with a former student of yours.
That's right, yeah.
Now Father Gregory Pine, who's a Dominican priest and serves as the adjunct professor of dogmatic theology at the Dominican House of Studies. He's also assistant director of the Thomistic Institute. Looking back at this clip, Father Gregory Pine answers, how can we know we're not living in the Matrix?
With any first principles, you can't typically prove them in a demonstrative sense, but you can show dialectically that if you don't hold for them, then your life is weird. So like the principle of non-contradiction in the speculative order, that a thing can't both be and not be in the same order, in the same respect, you can't prove that. There's a voice in the tradition who says, for those who deny it, they don't need a proof, they don't need an argument, and they need to be beaten and then ask whether it is not the same to be beaten and not beaten, because there's a way in which reality reinforces its intelligibility and its integrity. And so when it comes to approaching reality with a certain confidence that reality is as it projects itself, it's just sensible. So in the first proof for the existence of God, St. Thomas just says, motion is evident to the senses. Basically, stuff changes. We observe that to be the case. Now, even if we were deceived in our vision, at the very least, there's a change in our perception. And so that's a change. So things are still changing, and that's the only starting point upon which we can subsequently reason in making the first way and still get the goods. And so I think that a lot of people tie themselves in knots or perform very difficult mental gymnastics as a way by which to say, you can't possibly argue on the basis of this. But it's we're all starting somewhere. Everyone admits certain brute facts. And I'm choosing these brute facts because they seem to correspond to my experience. So I would say simply I'm not going to prove to you that we don't live in the Matrix. I believe certain things about God about Christ, about the sacramental order, which make it really hard for me to believe that anything like that is even remotely plausible. But my life lived in this non-matrix-like trajectory for the past however many years. It's borne fruit in the sense that if I approach reality in this way, reality tends to interact with me and I with it in fruitful, propitious ways. So I think often it's like that. So when people say, you have to prove this, you can push back to them and say, no, not necessarily.
So fascinating question that Father Gregory Pine was tackling there, and just making the note that if we're deceived by vision, there's a change. But he also was giving us permission to say we don't have to engage with having to prove X, Y, Z all the time.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because there's a lot of speculation that often puts people that think the universe has purpose and there's purpose and meaning sort of on the back foot, right? And so in a sense, like, well, demonstrate the universe has purpose, demonstrate your life has purpose. Well, demonstrate it doesn't, right? Show me that it doesn't have purpose, right? So it's, and he points out that a lot of it is not some logical proof that you have purpose, but it's looking at, okay, if I look at my life, I've seen that I have free will, and that gives me some, it resonates with how I've lived my life. I've made decisions, and those have affected me, and I live with the consequences of those decisions. So how do I prove I have free will? Well, that's the way that makes most sense given how we operate in the world. Like you said, that's the fruitful way of looking at the world, rather than saying, oh, we don't have free will. That doesn't seem to be fruitful, and it doesn't resonate with how we really see ourselves in the world. We feel free. We hold people responsible for their actions and so forth. We don't necessarily have to prove that in the way, but something we have to prove. Really, the onus is on people that are going to prove you don't have free will, or you're living in the matrix, right? Those speculations, that's what somebody has to demonstrate, because our everyday experience shows the exact opposite, right? And that's borne fruit in our lives. Like he said, that idea that I'm not in the matrix and that I'm in the real world, and it bears fruit in how I have lived my life.
Yeah. But I think even just looking back at these clips that we've done throughout the podcast, you can see, okay, Dominican priest there, we had a neuroscientist, we had a biologist, we had, all these different fields answering these big questions. But again, those truths kept coming up to the surface. For viewers and listeners who have been, following along all these seasons, and if they're interested in exploring very similar topics, and if they're asking these big questions that we've been asking, where can they go now? Are there any resources that you want to point them towards? Yeah,
what we've been pointing to them throughout this our 5 seasons is the Magda Center website, the Purposeful Universe website. Has a lot more videos and a lot more articles about these topics. And so there's sort of a wealth of resources there for people that are interested. And then, I'll make a plug for the Society of Catholic Scientists website. Has a lot of articles that sort of cross-disciplinary. We have theologians, philosophers, scientists that write about these issues on that website. And so that's a great place to go for further learning and go deeper into these issues. And the Society of Catholic Scientists will probably be starting a podcast as well and looking at some of these issues. And that's another place people can turn to.
Which you're the vice president of, I should note. So you've caught the podcasting bug, it sounds like.
Yes, I don't know. I can't shake it now.
No, but just, when I'm looking back, I've learned so much. I really consider myself just a perpetual student. And in this case, definitely I've been the student, as we've been sitting with all these different professors, yourself included. And I think my hope too is, yes, it's so when you explore the abundant order in the universe, from the galaxies down to the human person, one of my hopes that people take away from this, and no matter their walk of life and, where they're at personally, is that they can sit and ponder about, am I made with a purpose then? What does this mean about me? And can really think about that, because I think it's obvious when you look at headlines, you just observe the reality around us. There does seem to be this crisis of purposelessness that people are grappling with for lots of different reasons. And so I think just even on the practical, personal side, if this has reached someone, that they can sit with this, that we've been exploring, there is abundant order and therefore that points to a purpose.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right, and that's why I like the flow that we had. It's starting with the science, but not staying there.
Yeah.
Right? Let's reflect on the science, and that's what philosophy and theology can reflect upon what the science shows us, right? And sort of cure those sort of ills where people say, the science demonstrates X. Science demonstrates we don't have any meaning. Science demonstrates that there's no God, that there's no purpose. It does nothing of the sort, right? The science points to, hey, there's a lot of order here. There's a lot of patterns, that we see as this beautiful order that's sort of gifted to creation, right? And then now let's sit there and reflect upon that. What does that mean that we as humans are part of that order? What does that mean for us? Those are not scientific questions, although they flow out of the science, right? And that's where, we talk about music. Why do humans music and
why
art?
Do they make music?
Right. What is it about us that drives us to do that, right? What is it about us that drives us to look to something beyond, beyond life? Why is it that humans alone struggle with the idea of death? You don't see, your dog thinking and contemplating, being worried about death. That humans, that's so. There's something about us that brings, I think, the material world, the creation to fruition. And allows us to contemplate these questions of purpose and meaning, right? And then try to answer them. And that's what we want people to do, and not be, cut them off and say, there must be no purpose because science has demonstrated X. I think that's the one thing I hope people would come away, that, there's much more meaning to things than what science can tell you.
Are you exhausted by that misconception that faith and science have to conflict? I mean, I feel like you probably, because that's such an area of your expertise, is this intersection of faith and science. I know you get that question a lot.
Yeah, no, it is one of those, probably the biggest misconception out there, that faith and science must be, in conflict with each other. And as a Catholic, that's the opposite of the Catholic view of what science is. Science reveals something about God's creation, and brings us closer to God. The more you delve into the mystery of creation, I think the more you approach God, right? That the mind that's behind creation, and whether people are at the point where they can say that's God or not. Well, that's for individuals to come to their own terms towards. But I think most people, when you look at science and look at the order, you come away with this sense of awe, right? Wow, it's amazing how the universe is put together, and that sense of awe can then wonder. Can point you towards, a source of that.
Yeah,
I think
the more we've been diving into it, the more you realize how much complexity there is. And I imagine you see that, firsthand as a biologist, in your personal studies and research, and that does create awe and wonder about how each one of us is so complex, and also how we encourage people to ask these big questions, to be grappling with and seeking truth. There was a quote we, said earlier on in this season when we were talking about Edith Stein, and she had a quote that was something along the lines of, anyone who is seeking truth is seeking God, whether or not they realize it. And that's, again, it's good to seek answers. It's good to ask those big questions.
That is. And the keeping humble and that truth, goodness, and beauty bring us to the source of that, right? And I think that's from science, from philosophy, from art, all of those. That's the I guess the place of departure we want to be going into, all of these disciplines with that mindset.
Again, just reflecting back, because this is our chance to be nostalgic, and I'm feeling all the sentimentality, but having the chance to podcast, this is the first time I've been involved in a podcast as well. My background is in broadcasting and media and reporting, totally different medium. Okay. I'm used to having to capture, sound bites, whereas we're having conversations that are 45 to 60 minutes long, where there's so much depth. And quite frankly, it has been at different times daunting for me as we're bringing on these.
Yeah, I thought you were natural to this.
I've
take my
been
cues
following
from you
your lead. No, I've been following your lead. So, but even just, as we're sitting with scholars of all different fields, it's been very humbling and exciting to see all that there is more to learn. And hopefully to, make it as accessible as possible for our listeners and viewers. Dan, did you have any, just final thoughts as we're wrapping up Purposeful Lab.
Yeah, no, I think that the thing that I have been left with this is how little I know, right? And how every episode I have, we bring somebody, I want to go read something that they brought up, and this idea of, that we can never exhaust what we can know. Like there's always more to know, which is seems daunting at once, but it's a beautiful thing because there's so much richness to reality that we can never exhaust all of it, and that's something that hopefully comes through in the podcast.
Yeah, and even there were different times at different areas that we had. Maybe guests would disagree on a certain thing. For example, are there UFOs, or is there possibility of life on other planets? That's one example where maybe guests had different opinions, and there are areas where it's okay to have different opinions too.
Right. Yeah. And that's, we're all seeking the truth, and we all, we're not there and we'll never be there, but, it's all in good faith and humility and respecting other people's, the different opinions. And so we can work through these issues. Yeah.
Well, and as you mentioned, Purposeful Lab really was an evolution of the Purposeful Universe project, which started 3 years ago because of the Templeton grant. And Purposeful Universe, again, on the Magis Center website, lots of videos on the YouTube. There's so many beautiful videos, including this really beautiful video with Dr. Karin Oberg, whom we've mentioned already. And she really, I think, captures the mission we've been doing here at our podcast. So let's take a listen to Dr. Karin Oberg.
Are we alone as a living planet in the universe? There is a story of that over time our insignificance have only gotten worse. I don't think we should worry too much that we discovered that the universe is a little bit bigger than we once thought. The thing that I'm most excited about in astronomy is trying to figure out how planets form and what the likelihood is that we can find life elsewhere in the universe. If I were to dream what the next few decades would hold, it would be that we would find some extraterrestrial bacteria somewhere. Almost every star has a planet, hundreds of billions of planets. Even if just a small fraction of those have similar conditions to early Earth, that would suggest there are many, many places where life could have originated in our galaxy. It's easy to feel a bit insignificant when you put it like that. Does this matter for how we should think about our own worth? I would argue that it doesn't. What matters is that you are fearless in that pursuit and that you keep that obsession with the truth alive.
Yeah, as an educator, I couldn't sum up better what I want to instill in my students. But it's not just for students. This is for everyone, that everyone to have this fearless pursuit of the truth throughout your life at every stage.
Mm-hmm. And I think that clip, what Dr. Oberg was saying, just is the perfect way to end Purposeful Lab, to end this podcast. Dan, it has been a privilege.
It's been a pleasure working with you, Catherine.
And the entire team who behind the cameras.
Yeah.
It's a lot of us, but a privilege to work with you. And thank you all for watching. We'll leave it there. Bye-bye.